We're going to get started with this session. This session is looking at climate mobility literacy. How are we educating people about climate change? How are we educating them about the connections between climate risk and people having to move? What have we learned in this field? What works, what doesn't? But also, where are we at in terms of our understanding of climate mobility? So we'll start with a bit of an overview presentation and then go into a panel. And I'm very pleased to have a dear collaborator with us to introduce this session, Dr. Alex de Scherbenen, who joins us from the Columbia Climate School. We've worked closely together both on our Africa Climate Mobility Initiative and the Greater Caribbean Initiative. And Alex has, I think, a very reputable career on climate mobility, one of the kind of big fathers of the field, done a lot of research in this space, but also a lot of work that directly contributes to policy and programming in the field. So we're very excited to have him with us. And Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. That's very, very kind. So I did prepare a PowerPoint. Maybe it'll show up in a minute. But and the clicker's right here. Fantastic. Yeah, so I'm at the center. We call it CIESIN, C-I-E-S-I-N. You can call it by the longer name if you like. As Sarah said, I've been kind of in this field since, I would say, 2007 or so. I was commissioned by the UN Population Division to do a paper on geospatial kind of what would the future population geography look like? How might population shift or change as a result of climate change? And so that was my start. And then I worked with Coco on a wonderful report soon thereafter called In Search of Shelter, which still gets a lot of citations, and it was a wonderful collaboration. So I'm going to keep it short, but two main focus. Unfortunately, I can't see the screen, so I'm going to keep looking behind me. Data and knowledge gaps, and then sort of what do we have in terms of data that are actually available now. So let's start with the data and knowledge gaps. And you could probably, like, I'm an academic, right, a researcher, so I'm going to tell you there's just so much we don't know because that's the nature of my job. But I'll just point out a few highlights, and then if you're really interested in more, Nick Simpson, who was involved with the GCCM, up until a couple of years ago on the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. He led a lot of work on that. He authored a paper on One Earth. Robert Oakes at UNU EHS, which Coco used to run, also did a great piece that I contributed to. And then Bear and Sheway have something on climate mobility modeling if you want to look at that. But there are, big gaps in our understanding of what the gender dynamics are, who, is harmed more by climate impacts, who gets to move, who doesn't get to move, are females more likely to be trapped than males in kind of an involuntary immobile situations. How do you measure trapped populations? You could start by saying, well, if you have the aspiration to move and you don't have the capability, you are trapped by definition. But not everybody who has the aspiration, if you were to relieve the capability element and sort of give them a bus ticket or allow them to move, will actually move. So measuring trapped populations is not all that easy. How does mobility to new areas increase or decrease risk? Are we kind of at risk of going from the frying pan into the fire, proverbially? What is the awareness and public perception of climate mobility? That's going to be a topic for today's panel, and I hope our panelists will solve that for us. But we need to work harder on making this, a higher priority issue. And what are some of the geographic gaps? So this is a paper. I was looking for, something, and this paper came up. I'm not sure it's the authoritative paper, but I thought it was useful to look at. They did 161 studies on climate mobility, and they mapped them globally. And if you see the pattern, it looks like a lot of the work has been in the global south. There's been some in North America, and there's clearly been a bit in parts of China and East Asia. but there are just huge blank spaces on this map, right, that we don't know a lot about, that we haven't studied. There's sort of maybe a perception in the climate mobility research, or at least the public perception, that this is a southern problem, a developing country issue, but actually, most of the calls I get from the press are, what's going to happen to the U.S.? How are people going to move as a result of sea level rise? What's going to happen to all those assets in the coastal zone that are suddenly literally underwater? These are two research questions that I think are particularly pressing. Personally, these are sort of my top picks. One is, partly covered in this article that I co-authored with a postdoc, Cascade Tucholsky, which looks at sort of what are, the paper addresses this indirectly. We basically say there's a lot of studies looking at the agricultural pathway, but we're not enough studies that actually tease out the interlinkages, like from the climate variable through livelihoods, through the actual agricultural response and things, to the actual mobility. So there's a lot of assumptions that go into this agricultural pathway that aren't always borne out maybe in reality. But I do think there's a potential for a lot of young people voting with their feet, and sort of because they see profitability in agriculture declining. They see agriculture basically being not invested in a lot of countries, market problems in terms of being able to actually market your goods. They don't see a real future in this. And then you overlay on top of that the continual bad news about climate change, and you might get, not just that climate is actually impacting their agriculture, which it is, but also the sense that in 10 to 20 to 30 years, agriculture may become less viable. What's going to be the implications for people leaving rural areas? What's going to be the implications for a lot of countries in terms of food security? And then the other side of it is, where are people going to go? And this is kind of, one representative study. I think there could be a lot more of these studies about how migrants from rural areas, particularly those affected by climate hazards, enter into urban centers and find themselves in situations where they're essentially forced to live in informal settlements, which are also high risk. And so how can cities kind of cope with this new influx? Other research in terms of approaches, I would just say longitudinal studies are really important. Vali Kubi at ETH in Zurich has done a lot of these longitudinal long-term analyses in Vietnam, in Bangladesh. And I think that those really give us a lot more richness in terms of understanding, rather than these cross-sectional studies, understanding how things evolve in the rural economy and what the multiple factors are that go into people choosing to leave the rural areas. We need more comparative studies. We just been leading a study that was funded by the Department of Defense until it was cut in February because of new priorities. But that was looking at West Africa and Central America in comparative perspective, and what the drivers are out of these two regions in terms of migration, not just climate, but a range of factors. And I thought it was particularly rich, learning more and more about what survey research can actually tell us about the drivers. Mixed methods approaches that are contextualized. There's some really good literature, including one in a recent paper that came out in Frontiers in Climate. I edit this section on climate mobility by Turner et al., Matthew Turner, and they really emphasize the importance of locally contextualized research that actually asks migrants themselves why they're moving. More policy-oriented. And moving to policy, what do we need to know about adaptation? This is pretty much all from Nick Simpson's article, but there's a range of things like, how can we integrate adaptation planning into to have better mobility outcomes, not necessarily to keep people in place, because that may not be the goal of the people themselves, but to include things like the right to stay, but also the right to be mobile. I think there's a need for understanding what facilitated migration looks like. Is there processes that would allow people to move back and forth more seamlessly between two areas? What are nature-based solutions? Big issue that I've been focused on for a number of years is planned relocation, how to preserve people's rights. And when is mobility adaptive or not adaptive? There's Kira Vink has done some really interesting work in this area, and I think we need to know more about that. coming soon, actually Sarah is going to be guest editing with Anne Christine Link, recently minted PhD, who's also at UNU EHS, looking at adaptation journeys and in what ways is climate mobility adaptive or potentially non-adaptive for both people who stay and people who go. So I'm going to turn quickly to data, and then I think we'll do the panel, which I'm excited about. So there's a lot of open data. I think there's often a cry for more data, and I'm just highlighting really what we do have, because I think there's a growing amount of data that can be really useful for, in particular, geospatial analyses, which is what our forte is at Season. This is a paper just came out in the last few days, and it was basically looking at the likelihood of displacement from it's a modeling effort looking at 4 different types of risks: cyclone winds, coastal floods, river floods, and drought. The lighter shaded areas are those areas that are likely to have more annual average displacement based on these models that they've constructed. And you can see coastal zones in particular, but parts of the Amazon basin, Ethiopia stands out, and much of India stands out for being at high risk of displacement. This is a work that we just completed recently under USAID funding, which is now no longer, but we had funding under something called the Climate Adaptation Support Activity to do an urban climate risk and vulnerability assessment. And so these are all future, so the last one was basically historical data on climate risks. You can also just pull a ton of data off the internet, essentially, open access data on future risks related to high temperatures, water scarcity, riverine flooding, storm surge, cyclone winds, landslides. We use these data in combination with something that I hope is on the next slide. Well, it's not. It's 2 slides from now. But the data that we use were basically combined with city level maps to look at where the cities of low and middle income countries, LMICs, which ones had the highest risk, and also within those cities, which low socioeconomic status neighborhoods had the highest exposure. This is an example of a global data set that we put together. It's version 1.1 of a data set that we launched about 2 or 3 years ago, which has already been highly cited, which pulls together best available global data, satellite and socioeconomic data to map essentially equivalent of poverty or relative deprivation. And it can get pretty granular. So you can actually, and we've been working with some researchers who say it has real power. For instance, for CAP modeling, you can explain a lot of building damage by looking at the socioeconomic status of the neighborhoods. These data are now these were originally done under a NASA project contract that we had called the Socioeconomic Data and Application Center. We produced the data and then we were cut. So we've now moved all the data to the Harvard Dataverse. So you can actually get these data free of charge from the Harvard Dataverse. And this is going back to those future climate exposures, we were looking at low income neighborhoods. And so we actually used OpenStreetMap, used a database called the Global Urban Centers Database. We combined it with Overture Buildings data. See all those little dots? They're meant to represent buildings. We could then separate plots by doing what are called Voronoi polygons around each building. And then you could determine whether those buildings or houses essentially have access to roads or to streets. If they don't have access to streets, there's a very high likelihood that they're low socioeconomic status neighborhoods. So they're not necessarily informal settlements or slums, but they're probably low socioeconomic status. So we were able to actually create a database for over 5,000 cities called City Segments version 1. And when we validated it against actual slum mapping data from each country, they actually had a very high degree of correspondence. It wasn't 100%, but I would say these areas were slightly broader than the slum areas, but all the slum areas were nested within the low socioeconomic status neighborhoods that we created. And again, you can go to the Harvard Dataverse and download these data. So this is my last slide. There are a bunch of mobility data from different sources, censuses. Coco can talk about this a lot more than I can. but wonderful data that are available, each with different strengths and weaknesses vis-a-vis looking at climate-related mobility. I'm not going to go into all the small print, but just to say that there are a lot of data. There is undoubtedly a need for more in this space, especially since, you know, a lot of surveys and a lot of, frankly, censuses now. One of the things that's happening, and you may not be aware of it in this room, but response rates are just nosediving in many countries. So that's another issue that we're facing, is that people are fearful of government, or they don't trust government, and they're not responding to censuses. So we also need to get out the vote, in the sense to get people to actually respond to censuses, because those are our baseline data for really understanding a lot of these dynamics. Surveys are, you know, generally sporadic and don't cover, you know, the same size population. So censuses really are the gold standard. I think I'll stop there in the interest of time. I just wanted to point out, though, this morning I was on a call with IOM colleagues, and they were with IDMC, the International Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. They were showing that they're actually now collecting demographic data on displacees. So this is a really important development, because we can now tell, you know, whether people are within certain age brackets, male or female, et cetera. And so this database has just been launched on HDX. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for giving us this overview, both of what have we still to learn about climate mobility, and where can we find some of the foundational data to analyze climate mobility dynamics. I'm very pleased to have our second keynote speaker join us, Ms. Hamdi Abdi Isse from the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Somalia. We've been working closely together on looking at climate mobility dynamics in Somalia. And we've been also working closely together in building capacity of young people. And Somalia just launched a youth fellowship program to build climate leadership in the country. And so we're very pleased to have Ms. Abdi Isse with us to share a little bit of their experience. So the floor is yours.
Bismillah. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and youth representatives, it's a great honor for me today to stand in front of you and to represent youth from Somalia and from the Ministry of Environment as well. Today I will focus on three key areas, which are the current gaps in climate literacy, the impacts it has on Somali youth, and the ministry's strategy and the government's programs to address these gaps. Number one, we observed gaps in climate literacy, and as you may be aware of, most of you, Somalia faces repeated cycles of droughts, floods, and environmental degradation that disrupt lives, livelihoods, and the national stability. However, critical plans and gaps in climate literacy hinder effective responses. And number one, limited access to climate knowledge. Many Somali communities, especially rural and pastoral population, lack access to reliable climate information and early warning systems. Climate concepts are seldom communicated in local languages or through youth-friendly platforms, leaving millions of Somali youth or Somalis uninformed about adaptation and resilience building strategies. According to Somali National Adaptation Plan 2026-2030, over 70% Somali youth lives in rural areas, reliant on climate-sensitive sectors like agriculture and livestock. Yet they have little to no access to structured climate education. Somali youth are the front line, but they are front line all the time, but they are unprepared somehow, because of why Somali youth comprises over 70% of our population, making them the majority demographic affected by climate change. Our youth face challenges such as displacement due to recurrent droughts and floods, loss of livelihoods, particularly agriculture and pastoral systems. Despite being the most affected, youth often lack opportunities to engage in decision making, sometimes both national and all the time international platforms. Many students graduate without a basic understanding of environmental sustainability, adaptation, resilience strategies. Somali teachers lack specialized trainings and resources on climate-related subjects. What is the government and through the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change strategies and actions? We recognized all the mentioned challenges, and the ministry took a bold steps to institutionalize climate literacy and youth leadership. We developed early this year National Environmental and Climate Action Engagement Plan for Youth and Children, supported by UNICEF. This is the Somali's first ever national framework dedicated to youth and children in climate action. It is first strategic pillar focuses on climate education and awareness, ensuring young people gain the knowledge needed to lead climate resilience efforts. Integration with the Ministry of Education. Somalia launched an initiative of integration education to climate studies into schools, curricula at primary, secondary, and university levels. And this will equip students with the climate knowledge from an early age, train teachers with a specialized resource, and create a new generation of climate smart leaders. Somali Youth and Climate Change Conference that has been held August 2025 in Somalia. Last month we hosted the Somali Youth and Climate Conference, bringing together youth voices from across the country. The outcomes of this conference shaped our ongoing strategies and underscored the importance of youth-driven climate actions. We launched Somali Youth Climate Leadership Fellowship. On September 30 this month, we will officially launch Cohort 1 of Somali Youth Climate Leadership Fellowship in partnership with the Global Center for Climate Mobility. This 8-week program will train 100 youth fellows from the Banaadir region, the capital city, and all federal member states in the country. It will focus climate science and education, climate policy and negotiations, climate finance and adaptation planning. This fellowship will prepare our youth to represent Somalia at COP30 in Brazil this November. Tomorrow, 26th September, we will publicly announce the selected fellow. With that said, building climate literacy is not just an educational goal. For us, it's a national survival strategy. By empowering our youth and people with knowledge, skills, and leadership opportunities, we are securing a climate resilient future for Somalia. The government of Somalia, through the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, remains committed to bridging climate knowledge gaps, extending access to climate education, and amplifying youth voices in national and international platforms. To mention, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change of Somalia is just 3 years old. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chief of Staff Abdi Issa. That's a good reminder. I think we're actually of similar ages. GCCM and MOECC have learned to walk together, and I'm very proud of our joint achievements so far. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing this. So without further ado, I would like to invite our panel up on stage. This panel will be moderated by Mr. Hannes Einsborn, who's a senior expert at the Robert Bosch Stiftung, one of our also partners that has worked with us since the early days, and he'll be moderating. I think, Hannes, you can probably moderate from the seated area, and I'll let you to introduce the panelists. Yeah.
It's on? Okay. Great that you can all hear me. I have the pleasure to moderate this panel, and just as a reminder what we are talking about, it's really about bringing that knowledge that Alex has mentioned to the people that need to make decisions about their lives, where they want to move, where they want to spend, where their kids should spend their lives, also with the impact of climate change that we are seeing. So it's really a key issue that we're discussing today, and it's really about, I think that it says here, the positive adaptation journeys, and I think what we're discussing here is really making them happen with providing people the knowledge about the impacts of climate change. And I have the pleasure of a wonderful panel, and to my right, we have Badin Bode, who is the Deputy Head of the Education Department at the Siemens Stiftung. And he works a lot on climate change education in Africa, Europe, and Latin America. So I think he will tell us a lot about some of the lessons that he's learned in this work. Then to my very right, we have Coco Warner. She's now the director at the University of Pennsylvania's International Climate Observatory. And her role, in this role, she's really trying to connect the knowledge that we have with the communities and with the people that are affected most heavily by climate change. And previously she was the director of IOM's Global Data Institute. She was also at UNFCCC, looking at the impacts of climate change and looking at adaptation. So really has a great career, and we'll talk a lot probably about what she has learned throughout these years. To my left, we have Chiamaka Akpuoku. She's a climate mobility fellow here at the Global Center for Climate Mobility. And by training, she's a lawyer from Nigeria, and she's looking, as I understand, also a lot at the gender dimension of migration and climate change. So I think it'd be also great to hear from you, and also looking at the issue of youth and how youth can also have a say in knowledge and information about climate change. So I think we'll learn a lot from her about that perspective. And then lastly, we have Estela Aragon. She's the coordinator of the Climate Mobility Academy here at the GCCM. And she will talk about what the Climate Mobility Academy is and what it aims to achieve. So without further ado, I will do a quick rapid fire question to kick us off. And I will ask you guys all, how good are we in promoting literacy about climate change and climate mobility? And if you can, maybe from a range from 1 to 5, and 5 is the best and 1 is the worst, if you can maybe give me a quick response so we can kick us off. Estela, what do you think?
From 1 to 5. I would have to say, and I'm sorry if I can give you a straight answer.
It's on.
Okay. I think it's not easy to give like a straight answer on 1 to 5 because it depends on the sector. So if you go to the academy and to the scientific sector, like I could say probably 4
okay.
to 5, it depends. If you go to the general public, I would have to say 1 or 2.
Okay, so we have still lots to do. Chiamaka?
I think 2, just because there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation on all sides, and so there's still a lot of work to be done.
Okay, Badin?
Yes, also 2, as we are working already since more than 9 years in that sector, I noticed that, of course, there is something happening and it's moving, no, but we can do much more, so it's a 2 only.
Okay, Coco, will you have a different number, or will you also say 2?
Yeah, this sounds like groupthink. So with the growth mindset, you'll say, we're not there yet. And I think what we would want is for the literacy, the data, the knowledge to be useful for meaningful action that helps the people, let's say communities, build their resilience. So in that sense, like you said, we're really good at science. We're really good at different silos, but we're not there yet. I'd give us a 2.
Okay.
A 2.
So we have a sobering picture here. we have some knowledge, but we need to bring it to the community. So I think that leads me to ask you, Badin, because you're working in this sector, you're doing climate change education. Can you talk a little bit about some of the approaches that you have at the Siemens Stiftung, and also what you have learned in your work?
Sure, thank you very much. Thank you for letting me speak here, of course, because the climate mobility and climate change education is actually very close to each other, no? And that's why I think we can also, that's an offer to work together afterwards, of course, no? So just to give a little bit of context, in Siemens Stiftung, as I said, we work since more than 9 years in the topic of climate change education. We are focusing on the creation of open educational resources and teacher trainings, really, and the third pillar is advocacy, what we are doing right now here, no? And the learnings in the field, well, we started very fresh and new 9 years ago, and since that point, of course, we adapted all the resources somehow, or we created the resources on the basis of the IPCC reports. Very complicated, very complex, and we broke it down for the teachers, and this wasn't an easy task, of course. No, it's not only Somalia, as we just heard, that has really, really big challenges in implementing climate change education, or even talk about that in schools. No, the curricula are not really prepared for it, and it's now starting slowly, really, to be written into the curricula. But just to write this in the curricula doesn't mean really that the teachers can teach us, no? And that's why this complex topic has to be addressed with a lot of time and a lot of sincerity, no? And I think what we have learned there is that contextualization is the key to go, and this fits very well to the climate mobility aspect, no? So we work mainly in the topic in Latin America and Africa. And there it's of course important, because these are very impacted regions, that we have a look at not the polar bears, of course, but on the real impacts of climate change, no? In these regions. So the resources that are there are contextualized, and really also the modules of teacher trainings are really based on the local impacts of climate change, and of course of the local educational realities, no? And these learnings that brought us there also lead to the assumption in the end that it has to be done much more. The contextualization of all these resources has to be taken seriously, you know, and we are working on it and bringing this to an implementation, really. I don't know how much time I have, but we can maybe talk about this a little bit later, because
that's an excellent start, Martina. Thanks so much for highlighting the different approaches that you do with working through teachers, and also, I mean, really also highlighting that the knowledge needs to be contextualized. And I think that leads me to Coco, because Coco, I would like to know from you, who are the people that we need to reach? And I think that also speaks to Badin, who has highlighted that you need to contextualize the knowledge. Who needs to understand climate mobility, and maybe building on from what you heard from Badin, how we can best reach them.
Absolutely, and thank you. I'd love to learn more about what you're doing. So even though I said communities just a couple of minutes ago, I'm going to choose a different audience here. And it really depends. It depends on what's necessary. So the data, the information needs to be really designed for someone who's going to take an action, a decision, who's going to prepare. So for all of us, climate literacy is about really thinking about who are we trying to serve. And it's different. Not everybody is serving the same group. We're all in this big thing together. So let me give you an example. If you wanted to inform finance, banks, multilateral development banks, they have the job of improving people's lives, often through infrastructure. Often they're working with countries that are home to millions of displaced people. And what kind of information do they need? Do they need to know how many displaced people? Sounds really reasonable. And then what else do they need? Is it helpful to let them know you have X million people displaced? I mean, like for the first 5 minutes of the conversation, useful. But then they'll want to know, who are the people? Are they females? Are they males? How old are they? What do they need? Do they need housing? Do they need jobs? Do they need identification documents so that they can get registered? And et cetera, et cetera. What do people need? And then they need to know all kinds of things about how would you put the finance together. And so if you're serving a multilateral development bank and trying to inform how do you get finance to inform specific actions that ultimately help communities, it's kind of a no-brainer, but think about what kind of data and climate literacy is needed for that audience. They may, if you're a bank, they may need to know, how is this particular site projected to change over time? Is the floodplain, is it going to remain as it is now? Is it drying out? Do you have higher exposure to windstorms? All of those kinds of things. Are you in a coastal area? So climate literacy in that case means take your areas of expertise, your data, and integrate it in ways that are really meaningful for the target audience. The kinds of data, the kinds of literacy would look different if it's like what you were talking about, Badine, if you're trying to empower school children to do X, Y, Z. And so I think that's been, for me, something that I've really learned with the amazing institutions and teams that I've had a chance to work with.
Thank you, Coco. And I think that's also potentially a good segue to talk to Estella, and because I think something that you do also at the Climate Mobility Academy is really, I think, similar to probably your role at University of Pennsylvania, is catering to different audiences and bringing together sort of the ecosystem that it maybe sort of have to be informed and have to be literate about climate mobility. And can you talk a little bit about what you're trying to do and also what are you seeing in terms of opportunities to collaborate with others in this space?
Absolutely. So perhaps I will just step back a bit and just mention that we've been discussing on this panel and again on the entire summit about the challenge and how difficult it is to move from data to knowledge to action. It is so difficult, it is so challenging. And this is exactly what we're trying to do with the Academy, is to bridge these gaps and to accelerate solutions. And we're trying to do this differently. We're trying to think about, okay, like if it is so challenging, what are we doing wrong? And what do we have to do differently? So what we're trying to do is that we're trying to create a platform for collaboration and for knowledge sharing. So, okay, this perhaps doesn't sound so different, but how are we doing this? We're doing this through 3 flagship programs. And you will see that as a key and pivotal part of these programs, we are putting at the right center youth and community knowledge. So acknowledging and understanding that knowledge and solutions can not only come from science, from data, but also from traditional knowledge, and from knowledge that is on youth. Yesterday they were talking about that, about how youth is not necessarily the future. Youth is now. Like, youth has knowledge, youth has something to contribute to the table, same as community and traditional knowledge. So we're trying to bring those voices up. The first flagship program that we have is the fellowship, the Climate Mobility Fellowship. And with these, we're trying to bring a group of young leaders from Africa, from the Pacific, from Latin America and the Caribbean, and actually we have some of them joining us on this summit, run right next to me. And we're trying to train them, to provide training on technical as well as on soft skills. We're also trying to give them the opportunity to have policy exposure, bringing them to events such as this, such as the COP. And we're also trying to help them gain experience on project and more hands-on experience. Our second program is on the climate mobility literacy campaign. And this campaign wants to generate awareness and to digest and present data and information in a more accessible manner to different audiences. We're targeting audiences that go from the general public to children, and actually we have fellows that are working on projects to give workshops to children in their own communities to provide education on climate mobility, and also to policymakers through policy briefs, through infographics. So creating different products that we think are going to be able to reach specific audiences, understanding again that you cannot think that one single report is going to reach all audiences all across. So trying to make things differently again. And our third program would be the Sandbox. And the Sandbox consists on generating spaces and platforms for different sectors to sit down together and discuss issues, identify needs, so that we acknowledge we cannot work from perceived needs, but from real needs, and to sit down together and discussing and finding out solutions and potential responses. So we're doing this firstly through a series of webinars. We already had the first one, and this year we have two coming up. So one is actually going to be tomorrow, and is on youth perspectives on climate mobility. And the other one that we have this year is going to be the 28th of November, and is going to be on the date of the Mediterranean, and is going to be on coastal cities. So that's something to look forward to.
Thank you, Estella, for that overview of what you do. And you already talked about youth, and we have one climate mobility fellow here. And I would be very curious to understand the efforts that you're leading, and also because we had in the previous keynote, we heard from Hamdi that this is really something that also the Somali government is trying to do. So why is why is youth such an important stakeholder in this? Can you elaborate, Chiamaka?
Thank you very much for this question. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think we've heard it time and time again that the youth population, like the time is now for the youths, just because the effects of climate change, of course, affects the youth. And for my continent, Africa, the youth comprise a significant population. And so it's they're right at the heart of the issues we are discussing on climate justice and mobility. And that's why I think it's important to talk about it, to expand on youth perspectives in this light. But then for my own talk, I wanted to expand on, what the youth are doing specifically in addressing and promoting climate education and literacy in regions most affected, like Africa, like the Caribbean, like Pacific Island, and that's what I would like to spotlight. I think when we typically talk about climate education, climate literacy, people think, for some at least, of an external expert coming to the community to deliver knowledge to them in this sense. And I think this is not true from my own lived experience, from my work, and most especially from my work with the climate mobility fellows that come from this continent. And so I would like to spotlight some of the work that we've been doing since the inception of our fellowship in June, and it's been an incredible journey. I'm going to be citing some of them that are here present. I'm going to start with Sophie right there. Sophie is from Uganda, and Sophie has been working to sensitize both government officials and local communities on climate mobility, the intersection of climate change and human mobility, and it's with the overarching goal of ensuring that state action reflects the lived realities of those most affected. Then the next fellow will be Bluetooth. Unfortunately, he's not here. He's from Zambia, but then across Zambia and the Southern African region, he's been working to sensitize those in rural communities, but then also engaging with policymakers at the top. Next will be Natalia. Unfortunately, she's not here, from Zimbabwe, but living in Botswana, and she's been leading geospatial. I'm not getting it right, it's technical for me, I'm a lawyer. And then she's been leading that in order to leverage drones, data, technologies to ensure that climate education is evidence-based, both for those that are sensitizing communities, but then also for decision makers. Next, I will go to the Pacific Island region, and I would refer to Brian from Vanuatu, Kato from Tuvalu, and they've been working to sensitize community members, both through arts and music for children in schools, which is what you were talking about, different methodologies for different target groups. And that's what they've been doing in that region. I would also like to talk about Maria from Tonga, who has been working to ensure the integration of climate change into school curriculums. And then finally, from that region, the last fellow there is Mika from Fiji, and he's been working to raise awareness on climate change for students in tertiary institutions. And he's been doing this to ensure that they are aware of this, but then also on the possibilities career-wise on how to join the movement to amplify perspectives when it comes to climate justice. But then finally, I would like to refer to Roy J, who is seated here. Roy J, could you wave, please? Well, Roy J is currently compiling an anthology of creative works, writing and arts to get the youth voices to share their own perceptions of climate change, of climate mobility. But then the overarching goal is to get them to start talking about this, to get them aware of this, and societally to raise consciousness about how important this is to talk about. And so from all these perspectives, the goal is to show that, the youths, especially the climate mobility fellows, are leading the charge in this, and we are grateful to the GCCM for this opportunity that they've afforded to us. But then most of their initiatives are community driven. There are two things to get from that. One is that the youth are doing incredible work. They are not waiting to be invited to the table. They are already sitting confidently and working. But then the next is that there is a need to further capacitate youth, because we talk about centering youth voices, but that requires capacity. And capacity in the sense of providing them with resources, tangible and intangible. It requires mentorship opportunities. It requires allowing them to access platforms like this one. Once again, thank you to GCCM. To be able to connect with and engage with decision makers, and that's something that is really incredible. And for myself, I am the fellow from Nigeria. I'm a lawyer. I've worked with displaced communities, but then I'm also a researcher researching climate precarity in Lagos. And so from my own, lived experience of working and seeing what is happening on ground, and also the policy work I've been doing with GCCM, what I've come to see is that with climate issues and climate crisis, but I use the word carefully to not sound alarmist, we see that communities often are the first responders to climate issues. And more than that, we see youths once again at the forefront of this. And so we see youths once again bridging the gap between generations, bridging the gap between their communities and the government. But most importantly, we see youths bridging the gap between, local realities, lived realities, and global debates such as this one. And that's very incredible. And so I think what I would like to wrap up with, because I can see you're looking at me, what I would like to emphasize most of all is that the youth are doing incredible work. And more than amplifying youth perspectives after the fact, it's important to recognize the youths, as educators, as leaders, as change agents. We are doing incredibly. I'm seeing a lot of young faces here, and I'm talking to you too. But then more than this, I think it's important to emphasize the need for an enabling environment for youth to thrive. And that is the key takeaway, because I think if we do this, then we can go a long way in ensuring that climate literacy and education is no longer uneven in a lot of ways, because we see that. And, I think that would provide a foundation for, for justice, for resilience, and all the other things we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you, Gemma, and I think that's very impressive, the different work that you're doing. And yeah, I think that's the time also maybe to open up and have your questions and comments. And I'm very excited that there's so much expertise in this room to talk about this issue. And I think we have a hard stop at half. Okay. So over to you for your question or comment.
Thanks so much for this thoughtful panel. I'm Claudia Santos, and I work across these thematic areas in Guinea-Bissau. And I would like to invite the panel to take a step back from climate mobility literacy and engage more on a self-reflective exercise on how do you see the evolution of the climate mobility scholarship over the years, and not only in terms of abandoning causal relationships that do not reflect the local context and the needs and aspirations and capabilities that we see on the ground, but also bringing a suggestion that was actually written by Alex here in one of his papers, that we need to be looking at migration scholarship to inform climate mobility scholarship. So how do you see the evolution of the climate mobility scholarship over the years, particularly as migration scholarship has made immense strides that need to be recognized within the climate mobility literacy. So I just want to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And we may not have the opportunity for all of the panel to respond to this question, but maybe one or two can speak to it. I see Coco getting ready.
I'm probably doing this for the longest. It's a really important question. And before I attempt to answer it or at least address it, I just want, with a lot of humility, to acknowledge this community, which is one source of a lot of the research and understanding that you're asking us to reflect on critically. So just a lot of respect, and it's been a huge privilege to be part of this community, and incredible, Chiamaka, to see you just call out some of the amazing work and the fellows and the GCCM bringing us together. So much to say. My sense is over the past 10, maybe 20 years, that there's been an increasing understanding that yes, indeed, climate change and variables related to it interact with people's decisions to stay or to go. And some of those decisions you wouldn't even really call decisions. Sometimes it's a lack of options. And Alex, you really pointed that out. One thing that I would love to see moving forward is a refreshed lens, because I think we've described some of the issues pretty well. There's a fair, almost like a steady state in the research. It's okay. And most of the scholarship, a lot of the scholarship is pretty consistent. You have lots of case studies and a lot of understanding on livelihoods and MM. So that seems positive and good. I've also seen, I loved, Alex, the piece that you've always been so good at, and many people around you, the spatial and temporal dimensions. Some of the data lens is super exciting. That sounds great. Or it looks really, really helpful. But my sense is that really understanding what's going on is, it still eludes us. It's almost like we approach people moving with a very specific set of scholarship lenses. That's okay. But recently, I've been looking at insurance, bonds, mortgages in my own country. And when you get primary insurers withdrawing because of fire, or in places like California where you can't get a loan to buy a house if you don't have homeowners insurance, and the fires make it not really an insurable thing anymore, those kinds of combinations, people move away and they end up in my state, which is very far away from California. And we don't think about that being climate mobility. And yet, fresh lenses can help us understand a little bit more. What are the consequences? What would it mean for certain places over a period of time? It may not be that long. It might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, maybe less, more. What would it actually mean if populations redistribute? And And the reason, and I'll stop here, Hannes, but I love your question. And for me, I started by saying this. I really approach it with humility because it's almost as if a lot of our research feels a lot like development studies. There's nothing wrong with that. But we're in a moment of redefining not only ourselves, but how we work together. And some of that feels completely rotten. It's an awful moment that a lot of our world feels like. It feels like development cooperation and humanitarian and peace and security and multilateralism and some parts of climate cooperation are just like the wheels are falling off the bus. It feels really bad, but there's also an opportunity. And redefining our questions in the way that Hannes, you've been asking us about, redefining and asking ourselves what's necessary, what can we bring to the table together, how do we do it differently for the problems that we're redefining together. That feels also like a very uncomfortable, but it is an opportunity.
Thank you, Coco. Estella, you also wanted to respond.
Yeah, so super quick and actually highlighting the last point that you made, Coco. Before GCCM, I actually worked with IOM for about 8 years, leading research projects on mobility and on migration. And what I can say is that there's a lot of information that has to do with displacement, with mobility. But one of the issues that we face very often is that there are no clear indicators to speak about climate mobility. And one of the reasons is because people do not, and we know this, don't necessarily will self-report moving because of climate change, right? So when we would want to do a climate mobility study or something that had to do with that, we would have to use proxy indicators. So I think this speaks about the need of even when, of course, we have to talk about migration and mobility, and data on that is, of course, useful. We do need specific studies and specific research and indicators to speak about climate mobility. So we do need to be more specific about it, because information that we have on migration is just not enough to speak about the issue itself.
We have time for one more question, and then we have to unfortunately wrap up. I see three hands up. Maybe we can do 2 questions, and I think in the order of who put up their hand first, I see you, and then we have to close. Over to you for your question or comment.
First of all, thank you all, and thank you so much for highlighting the young perspectives, the young activists myself. It's really important to see all of your work. Thank you. I'll take a mic. I just wanted to ask, in your experience of climate literacy initiatives, what have you found is an effective framework and effective strategy for engaging meaningfully with communities instead of imposing a narrative? Because I know that's really a risk, and also specific demographics like women and young people, and then how do you engage differently with those communities without infusing bias?
Thank you. Can you also raise your question, and then we have to wrap up quickly after this? You can try. I think it's on. We'll hear you once you speak.
Okay, thank you very much. I think for climate literacy, climate mobility literacy, or climate literacy as a whole, I think it should be domesticated, okay, or it should be down to the type of hazard that is, or the type of movement, what is causing the movement, okay? Because she's from Nigeria, I'm from Nigeria, but if she's talking about the part of the country that she's coming from, I come from a different part, so our hazards are different. So what would move the people in the northern part of the country would be different from what would move the southerners, okay? So like for any climate literacy to be meaningful to the people, okay, it has to be really domesticated. It has to be done to serve, you know, what the people can see, what they've gone through, and I think that would make much difference. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, and I think that was a great point that you underlined here. I think, can you, who wants to respond to the first question? And then I think we have to wrap up after this. Chiamaka.
I'll just be very brief. I understand we don't have time. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think first of all, engagement with on climate literacy education has to be research informed, and that would require prioritizing participatory research methodologies to understand the way the people that you're trying to reach and educate, the way they think, their thoughts, their knowledges. It's important to understand their own knowledges to reflect, respond to their perspectives and really engage with them. That's number one. Number two, I think it's important to look at the means through which the target group can best be reached, right? And that would require, in this age, for youth going on TikTok. I was having, because I work also in a university in Oldenburg for international master's students on migration, and we were talking about this on climate education, right? And we were saying, what do we do? They were asking, can we make TikTok videos? Is it good? Do we send standard presentations? And I'm like, the goal is to share the message. The goal is to co-create knowledge and then disseminate knowledge. The goal is to have more actors in the field, raising awareness, amplifying voices. So you go wherever the young people are. You go wherever the target group are. You have the mindset of, you know, you can see it as a missionary job, getting as many disciples as possible, going wherever they are, you know. So it's important to have this in mind, you know, researching first of all, but then also using non-traditional you know, mediums, right? So TikTok, podcasts, storytelling, infographics, and that's something Estella has been telling us a lot about. Thank you.
Great examples, Chiamaka, thank you. And Badin, you have the final word. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So I think the three topics we were touching here are actually very well connected. No, what Chiamaka just said, the co-creation of the knowledge is very, very important here, but also the domestication of the knowledge, no, the contextualization, as I said before. I think also this has to be thought together with a change in education itself, no, because we are heading towards more active or activating education that really can make the difference in what am I learning here, no, for what am I learning this. And climate change education or climate literacy in general can be very well connected to the realities of people, no, because many people are really suffering from those, no, and without causing climate anxiety more or eco-anxiety, we have to think about project and problem-based learning solutions to really get to the point and find the solutions that can actually make climate action work in the field, no, and this can start from a very early age to to adult education, no, and I think this is a very big change that we have to do in education in general, but of course there are a lot of challenges because education itself is in crisis. So we have to think about much solutions and work together in a co-creational way, as you just said. No? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Badin, and thank you to all the panelists. This was a great discussion, and thank you to you.